The 17th and 18th century leading up to the Revolution in France was a period known as the Ancient Regime, which first saw a society based on feudalistic ideals, and then later the absolutist rule of Louis XIV and his successors in the marvelous Palace of Versailles. Today, we will be looking at French society in this time period through the lens of children. What was expected of them, how did they dress, and how or if their role changed throughout this period. In the Ancient Regime, typical of feudalistic society, there existed three classes, or estates. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate comprised of the nobility, and the third estate were the peasants and the new middle class, known as the bourgeoisie, who comprised the majority of the population. The first estate were the clergy, who did not have children, so we will not be touching on them in this video. At the start of their lives, most of the children of the second estate were baptized into the Catholic Church, as the majority of French nobles were Catholic. However, there was a minority group within the nobility of France known as the Huguenots. This was the name given to French Calvinists, who made up 10% of the population of France during the Wars of Religion. Their children were also baptized at the start of their lives, but obviously not in the Catholic Church. After baptism, Catholic children would follow through with the early Catholic sacraments, confirmation, communion, and confession. Children of Calvinists would not receive confirmation or confession as they were deemed illegitimate according to Calvinist theology. The French nobility gave their children good educations both before and during the reign of Louis XIV. But the sweeping changes made by Louis made it so that education was paramount in keeping power and influence. The introduction of mercantilism under Louis brought a middle class to France known as the bourgeoisie. This group was made up of ambitious and cunning merchants, entrepreneurs, and artisans that brought in lots of money for the king. As a show of disfavor against the existing nobility, who didn't bring in nearly as much money as the bourgeoisie, and were oftentimes indifferent or in opposition to the crown, King Louis XIV granted titles of nobility to the prominent new bourgeoisie middle class. Now in France, you have the old nobility, known as the nobility of the sword, whose nobility dated back to the Middle Ages and came from military service as a knight, which was a feudal title that, under Louis, was starting to become obsolete. And then you had this new nobility, the nobility of the robe, who, again, were prominent members of the bourgeoisie who had made a lot of money for the crown. They were more helpful to the king in achieving absolutism, and their titles of nobility were earned by their own merit. The old nobility, who had previously been despondent to the crown, now had to fight for the favor of the king so they wouldn't lose their power and influence to this new nobility. Their battleground for the king's favor was Versailles, a magnificent palace outside of Paris that had become a symbol of excess and culture. These conditions made it so that the education was of chief importance for the children of both factions of the nobility. The old nobility needed to educate their boys so that their cunning and ability matched that of the children of the new nobility. They needed to be good at math to match the proficiency of noble merchants' children. They needed their children to be proficient in linguistic and literary skills so that, again, they could match the proficiency and knowledge of culture of the children of the new nobility, who were already likely steeped in a wide variety of cultures. The new nobility needed their boys to be educated to keep sharp the skills that had acquired them this newfound power and influence. Education also taught obedience, which was paramount at a place like Versailles, where much of your political influence was based on how much you could kiss up to the king. Girls were educated during this time period. Their education was made so that a girl would be as marriageable as possible. They focused on art and literature so that they could keep up a conversation with a man in the hopes of being a more favorable candidate for marriage. Children of the nobility dressed proper and formal. Boys wore oftentimes extravagant embroidered long coats. They wore collars with layers of lace and cuffs. They wore undergarments to protect them from the rough materials that clothes were made of at the time. Boys did not wear pantaloons. Instead, they wore tights with baggy half pants over them. Girls wore extravagant dresses down to their feet. Their skirts were held up by a device called a farthingale. Over their dresses, they wore a cloak-like clothing known as a cantouche. Before Louis, clothes were generally made of wool and cloth, which were rough and coarse on the skin and mandated that children wear undershirts. After Louis, the introduction of mercantilism brought trade and new materials to make clothes from, like silk and linen. This made it no longer necessary for children to wear undershirts. The Third Estate, made up of peasants and the middle class, had some similarities and some differences to the Second Estate. Since all the Huguenots were nobles, and by the time the bourgeoisie came about, they were already gone from France, the children of the Third Estate were brought up Catholic and received the early Catholic sacraments. The children of the peasant faction of the Third Estate did not receive an education and only prepared to do whatever jobs their family did for the rest of their lives. The bourgeoisie children received similar educations to those of the Second Estate, in the hopes of being granted titles of nobility through their intellect and ability. They also dressed similarly to the children of the Second Estate. The peasant faction of the Third Estate mostly wore simple, plain, inexpensive tunics made of wool, and most were lucky if they had more than one outfit of clothing to wear.